For today's talk, I want to reflect briefly on some of the ideas in the second chapter of my book. So, in the first chapter, which deals with the horizon, I consider the circular and repetitive journeys of Black diasporic women and their arrival in countries like Canada and the United States in search of a place where they might arrive and stay. But the failure of the settler colonial states to deliver any desired freedom, so the way in which the horizon of possibilities gets delayed to some distant future, leads me in the second chapter to an act of return to the Caribbean where I sit with and think through the trope of the sea. In this chapter, I'm trying to sit with the collective memories of Caribbean foremothers in a reflection of what has been lost in the flight, both physical and metaphoric, away from the Caribbean and Africa. For Caribbean women who are descendants of enslaved Africans or indentured laborers, our access to the past is not only through memory, but also through water. Dion Brand, in A Map to the Door of No Return, acknowledges that water is the first thing in my imagination, the first thing in my memory. As she explains further, we have no ancestry except the black water and the door of no return. They signify space and not land, a vastness indeed beyond imagination. Like the Atlantic Ocean, the Kalapani, the black waters of the Atlantic, has become an indispensable metaphor of diaspora and the transoceanic imaginary. For Africans and Indians in the Caribbean, the Atlantic Ocean represents, as Jackie Alexander explains, the political histories of the disappeared, that which is otherwise unspeakable and untraceable. The ocean, as Christina Sharp writes further, is an archive of bones, human blood, death, loss, memory, and imagination, alive in hydrogen, in oxygen, in carbon, in phosphorus and iron, in sodium and chlorine, held still in the time of the wake. Residence time, Sharp explains, is the length of time it takes for a substance to enter and leave the ocean. For human blood, which is salty, that time is 260 million years. The energy, she continues, that is produced in the waters continues cycling like atoms in residence time. The sea as an archive of living memory allows me then to posit ocean waste and loss as indispensable from the Caribbean's past and present, a merging of the cross currents of African, Asian, and European diasporic hopes and losses. The sea has indeed come to symbolize the tangled roots of the Caribbean, the historical memories of not only Africans in Middle Passage, but also Europeans in the Sargasso Sea and Indians in Kalapani. All of these memories are held sacred in the shared recesses of the Atlantic Ocean and Caribbean Sea. The Atlantic Ocean, by functioning as a repository of Caribbean people's memories and stories in diaspora, makes possible a recognition of shared suffering, even as it connects us physically and spiritually across our multiple boundaries and histories. The crossing of the Atlantic cut off Africans from their cultural memories, threatened the dissolution of ritual purity for Indians, and made return possible for all of us, including European women. As a caution against an uncritical celebration of the sea as a kind of post-diaspora symbol of deterritorialization, Elizabeth DeLugre also reminds us that widespread state privatization of the seas has become synonymous with militarization, and that as a result of capitalism's excess waste, the Atlantic is the most polluted ocean in the world. The notion of heavy water accounts for the weight of history on the ocean, challenging neoliberal capitalism's claims of movement and progress and critiquing progressive modes of capitalist time. seas as heavy water flow, but also demand reflection and rememory of waste and the dead. When the sea is rendered as slavery, indentureship, and conquest, violence and mourning become symbolized by this spatial status. The past that before assumed a progressive movement forward now takes on a lingering, haunting presence. And I understand haunting in relation to processes of self reflection and introspection that lead ultimately to action. I argue, therefore, that it is necessary to articulate alternative relationships to the sea that recognize women's histories both in relation to political hegemonies of colonial and post colonial nations and as constituting a relational practice of resistance and survival. I suggest further that acknowledging the ways in which the sea is interwoven into indigenous Amerindian histories opens up other ways of theorizing the sea that makes space for these relational practices of survival. And I want to, and this is where I really want to focus my talk. And I begin with a quote by Hoffman, Bright, and Ramos, who argue that rather than cutting off and insulating the region's islands into secluded landforms and communities, the Caribbean Sea actually linked pre Columbian Amerindian communities to one another and facilitated human mobility and the constant exchange of goods and ideas. And if I might be allowed to share my screen, do I have sharing privileges, Honor?
We
Can
can
I be
make
a
you
co-host?
we can
Okay,
make you co-host.
thank you.
Sorry, just because I had pinned it now. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so I put the quote here. Right? So the argument oh, that they make, I'm trying to minimize my side screen so I can read the whole thing. Anyway, the highly variegated pre colonial Caribbean islandscape always had a dynamic, interconnected character, thanks to the maritime orientation of its native or Amerindian inhabitants and the region wide interaction networks they maintained. It is now commonly accepted that human islanders were never socially isolated except in very extreme cases, but rather that the sea likely functioned as an aquatic motorway, a plane that the islanders would have traversed frequently despite its occasional unpredictability. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay, so that was the quote, the idea that the Caribbean that the sea itself was a mode of travel and community for indigenous peoples before the arrival of the Europeans. This understanding of the sea's simultaneous function as land, sky, and water underscores the unique social and cultural geographies of islands, disrupting an understanding of the Caribbean that relies on binary conceptions of sea and land, island and continent, routedness and rootedness, and that moves us toward a more archipelagic sense of self and space. And I'm drawing here on Vicente Diaz's notion of an archipelagic way of knowing that recognizes the deep and profound kinship between humans and the animal world, as well as the genealogical connections between humans and animals on the one hand, with land and sea on the other. This sense of connectedness between land and sea challenges the binary assumption that Black diasporic histories are solely figured through water, while Indigenous histories are rooted in struggles over land. When we accept that pre Columbian Amerindian peoples were themselves seafarers and resituate them as the original discoverers and inhabitants of the Caribbean, we open up the trope of the sea beyond the diasporic reading of African and Indo Caribbean displacement to make room for a conceptualization of what it means to live in relation to place. In other words, to consider what happens after one lands. It was, after all, also the sea that brought the conquistadors to the island and mainland coastal shores where the Amerindians lived. The arrival of Columbus's ships and his landing marked the beginning of the formal history of these new so-called new worlds, conquered in a series of violent disappearing acts that plunged its original peoples into a forgotten and misremembered past. What did the Amerindians make of the first sighting of the Pinta, Nina, and Santa Maria as they pulled within sight of Guanahini, San Salvador Island on October 12, 1492? Did they get a glimpse of the horror the sea carried? And what did they make of each subsequent emergence from the sea of European enslavers, clergy, and merchants, of shackled and enslaved Africans, of soon to be brutalized indentured workers? Resituating Amerindians as witnesses to the catastrophic past and repositories of Caribbean sea memories forces a contention with the Caribbean as both sea and land, as a place where people lived for thousands of years before Columbus's arrival, and as a place of contemporary life for millions of people, not just as a place of diasporic arrival or departure. I invoke this sense of land in the way that Chania Cordes defines it as embedded within power laden spaces of social, spiritual, and cultural attachments and claims of belonging. Diaz's concept of an archipelagic way of knowing also helps to disrupt colonizing discourses of discovery and post colonial constructions of small island nations' insularity by forcing us to consider the deep global interactions at play in the formation of island identities and the means by which survival was and is possible under conditions of conquest. Contemporary discourses of development and underdevelopment are the modes through which post-colonial continental thinking continues to, as Diaz says, imagine itself into being and imagine this being to be the epicenters of big, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, worldly things and peoples, while regulating the backward, so-called backward island inhabitant, the Amerindian, African, or Indian, to an unlivable past and unimaginable future. I want to register what I am calling a sense of Caribbean women's interdependence, right? This thinking about the ways in which the Caribbean Sea functions as a metaphor of the entanglements of European conquest, African enslavement, and Indian indentureship through uh, a reading, I hope I have the time, of Grace Nichols, Guyanese poet Grace Nichols' collection, I Have Crossed an Ocean. These poems draw on Nichols' Guyanese roots to resituate African, Indian, and Amerindian women's presence in the region as a dual or shared relationship to land and sea. And she narrates the poems through the persona, a persona that she calls Carrie Woma. So Carrie Woma without the end, sorry, without the N at the end of woman. So this persona of Carrie Woma is a complex representation of Caribbean women's intersecting histories and oppressions. As a female embodiment of the Caribbean, she's a keeper of memory and seer of the future, both the Amerindian ancestress, keeping guard over the land and sea, and the Caribbean diasporic mother watching her children disperse across the world. I'm going to share my screen again. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. I am so sorry. I'm never this disorganized. Okay, so I want to, yeah, as I said, to move into a brief discussion of Nichols' poems in We Have Crossed an Ocean. So in the first poem, I Carry Woma watched history. Carrie Woma appears as a two-headed Janus, dual witness to the histories of colonial conquest and African enslavement. As a two-headed spirit, she is the Amerindian guardian of the shore, who witnesses the arrival of the conquistadors, but she's also the African foremother. In the poem's first scene, her head rises from her hammock on the Caribbean shore and turns toward the sea, sighting Columbus's ships bringing his corrupted offering of Christianity and civilization. In the poem's second stanza, In the poem's second stanza, her other head rises from deep within the bowels of a slave ship and swivels back like a Doen, the faceless plantation spirit whose feet are turned permanently backwards. This head gazes back at the past, at the shards of broken pots, the waves of palm wine betrayal. Body facing forward and head and feet facing backward, Kariwoma is connected to multiple places and histories, desiring a lost, irretrievable past. Unable to map a return across the Middle Passage, she joins the other half of herself on shore, the eyes of the sea almonds beckoning a cautious welcome across new shores. As the embodiment of the dual spirits of Amerindian and African women, Kariwoma also witnesses the arrival of other ships carrying indentured laborers, Indian, Chinese, Portuguese, and Irish, toward their Caribbean horizons of betrayed hope. The Atlantic, Kalapani, and Sargasso Sea, sorry, flow into the shorelines of the Caribbean and the Guianas, leading these arrivants to new lands. On these indigenous lands, bounded by the sea and ocean, African, Indian, and European histories, dreams, and memories converge. their song of exile, their drums of loss, are all caught in a weaving odyssey of no return. In the title poem, startling The Flying Fish and Is That You, Columbus, the Carriwoma continues her chronicling of the history of Caribbean conquest. Columbus's ships, the Pinta, Nina, and Santa Maria, are the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Columbus, staring day in, day out at the horizon, believed he had landed in Asia and arrived bearing an offering of Christianity and civilization in exchange for land and life. The colonial struggle over tierra, over land, startling the flying fish and the long sleep of history, and mark the differing and irreconcilable horizons of Caribbean and European hopes. The Carriwoma memories wash ashore like sound waves, the ocean holding sacred truths for those willing to listen and hear. It is in these sounds of the ocean that Carriwoma perceives Columbus's belated confession. But how could I have foreseen the dark vistas and the tears, the seeds of destruction that would flourish in discovery's wake? And so Carriwoma, in an act of reconciliation and commemoration, deciphers old names in old tongues, from the sounds of the ocean and the wind to retrace the footsteps of Amerindian presence in the Americas and make possible a new human Caribbean subjectivity. In this act of political and reparative justice, she restores the island's original Taino and Kalinago names: Guanahini, Salvador Island; Liamuiga, St. Kitts; Waomoni, Barbuda; Cairi, Trinidad; Quisqueya, Hispaniola; Aliaogana, Montserrat; Madinina, Martinique; Jamaica, Jamaica; Ionanalo, St. Lucia. The island's unconquered gaze still bears witness. Since she's also the repository of Black women's pain, Carriwoma mourns too for the dead Africans. Re-narrating Columbus's gospel of salvation, she locates heaven in the underbelly of the sea. In my sea house there are many mansions. Who knows more than me the songs of the drowning? She guards the living even as she commemorates the dead, to whom she offers a homage of continuous remembering. This commitment to living and survival extends to Carriwoma's diasporic children scattered across the globe, like migrating spider birds in Europe and North America. The sky, as a new mode of globalized travel, is linked through history to the sea, as Carriwoma's children create new triangulars across Atlantic. The sky sea facilitates migration to faraway horizons, registering the depth of Carriwoma's separation from her children, who are everywhere and nowhere. Diasporic dispersal thus brings a new kind of terror: the slave and indenture ship replaced by the airplane that sucks whole families abroad across the glittering sea we call sky. Carriwoma's diasporic children's rejection of what they perceive as island stasis and underdevelopment reflects their deep investment in the elusive promise of capitalist progress. The equally deep sense of loss occasioned by their physical and psychological departures is etched permanently in the face of the Indian cane cutter, a study of diasporic brooding. The grandfather mourns a new Kalipani loss, wailing for his only grandson departing for Canada to join his mother, and wailing also for the ancestors lost to history and time. Despite the incommensurable losses, the Caribbean remains the home toward and away from which Carriwoma's African and Indian children mark each journey. Like the Carriwoma, it is precisely this complex relationship to the Caribbean as a site of conquest, exile, memory, and return that I attend to in the trope of the sea. As I have tried to demonstrate, this kind of self reckoning demands an acknowledgement of all of the Caribbean's history, an attention to African, Indian, and Indigenous women's intersecting horizons, recognizing that while these histories are marked by deep differences and our desires may not always be the same, we must nonetheless name the intersecting logics of oppression that structure our lives. Thank you so much.